I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
King Charles had faced private papers before, but this one stopped him cold. Inside a sealed royal file connected to Queen Elizabeth II was a deeply personal message addressed directly to Camilla. A message carrying a warning about Charles, the future of the crown, and a choice Elizabeth feared might one day tear the family apart. The king read it once, then again, and when he finally lowered the page, those around him noticed something had changed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles kept his eyes on the page. The file had emerged during an internal cataloging review of Elizabeth's restricted papers, a collection kept apart from ordinary palace correspondence because it contained personal material never meant for routine circulation. This was not a constitutional instrument, meaning it had no legal power to command a sovereign or alter the line of succession. It was something more intimate, a mother speaking privately to the woman closest to her son. The message was direct. Queen Elizabeth II had warned Camilla never to place Charles in a position where loyalty to his wife could clash with his duty to William, the succession, and the future crown. Charles read those words again. What wounded him was not the idea that his mother distrusted Camilla. It was the opposite. Elizabeth understood how much influence the queen consort held over him, and that trust made the warning feel heavier. Charles lowered his glasses but did not rise. One passage disturbed him most, describing a future moment when he might be forced to choose between companionship and continuity. The phrase struck at something painfully real. William was not merely his son. The Prince of Wales was also the next link in the succession, the legal order determining who inherits the throne. Any lasting fracture between father and heir could become larger than a family argument. Then, another detail surfaced. An aide explained that Elizabeth had ordered the message kept outside normal correspondence and restricted until after her death. Charles said nothing. He folded his glasses, placed them beside the document, and remained still as the aide waited near the door. Silence became the answer. Whatever Elizabeth had feared, she had feared it enough to preserve these words beyond her lifetime. Charles could not leave them buried again. Before anyone else shaped their meaning, he made one decision. Camilla would hear about the message directly from him. But before Charles could face her with his mother's words between them, he had to confront something even more uncomfortable: why Elizabeth had written them in the first place. For Charles, this was never simply a royal problem. It was painfully personal. On one side stood Camilla, the woman who had shared decades of his most difficult years. On the other stood the memory of Queen Elizabeth II, the mother whose understanding of duty shaped almost every decision of his life. And suddenly, through a single private message, those two loyalties were no longer sitting peacefully beside each other. They were colliding. Charles carried that collision into the moments that followed. The crown, meaning the institution and duties attached to the sovereign rather than the physical crown, demanded distance, continuity, and judgment. Marriage demanded trust. He had spent years depending on Camilla for calm under public pressure, and now his mother's words had turned that private strength into the source of his deepest unease. Camilla sensed the change before Charles explained it. During a brief conversation, she watched him close a red document folder and keep one hand resting on it. She asked what was inside. He looked at her, paused, and answered only, "Something from my mother." The queen consort did not press him, but his restraint unsettled her more than anger might have done. Charles remembered how carefully Elizabeth chose emotional language. His mother had built her reign around institutional stability, the idea that the monarchy must survive personal pain without allowing that pain to damage the next generation. That was why the message felt heavier than advice. It sounded like a burden she had carried privately, and then left for him to understand. only when the time was right. Then one sentence changed the meaning of everything. Queen Elizabeth II had praised Camilla for her ability to steady Charles when pressure closed around him. She was not dismissing the woman beside her son. She was recognizing her power. But the praise came with a warning. The closer Camilla stood to the sovereign, the more careful she must be, never to create distance between him and the generation that would follow. Charles read the passage again and felt the conflict sharpen. Camilla had spent years proving she could remain beside him under relentless scrutiny. Yet Elizabeth's message suggested that success itself created a new responsibility. The stronger her influence became, the more dangerous any misunderstanding with William could become. One name appeared again and again in sensitive lines: William. Charles could no longer treat that repetition as coincidence, and Camilla could no longer ignore the question hidden inside his silence. To understand why Elizabeth feared a fracture between marriage and succession, the story returned to one private encounter that transformed a private concern into something she believed had to be recorded. The message did not begin with a scandal. It began with a conversation. Months before Elizabeth put her concerns into writing, a private exchange at Windsor Castle left her deeply unsettled. No shouting echoed through palace rooms. No dramatic order was issued. Yet something said that evening convinced the Queen that the future relationship between Charles, Camilla, and William could become more dangerous than anyone around them understood. Elizabeth had spent years thinking beyond Charles's accession. The accession, the moment a new monarch legally takes the throne after the previous sovereign dies, mattered to her because stability could not end with one generation. She worried about what came after Charles as much as what came before him. William's responsibilities meant the future king was becoming harder to separate from decisions about the monarchy's direction. Camilla believed Charles deserved room to breathe. During a private Windsor supper in 2021, she defended the man who had waited most of his life to reign, and said he should be allowed to build his future without constantly looking over his shoulder at the next one. Elizabeth understood immediately who the next one meant: William. The Queen did not challenge her across the table, but the phrase stayed with her. Elizabeth heard danger where Camilla intended protection. The Queen consort was not trying to erase William or weaken his place. She was trying to shield Charles from entering his reign, already feeling measured against his heir. But Elizabeth knew how easily protection could become distance. If Charles began seeing his son as pressure rather than continuity, the family conflict could eventually become a royal one. The silence after supper carried weight. Elizabeth remained behind after the others left and asked a private secretary to leave writing paper in her sitting room. A private secretary is a senior aide who manages a royal's official correspondence and schedule. She removed her glasses, sat down again, and replayed Camilla's words before deciding not to summon Charles. Elizabeth chose Camilla instead. Her message did not command obedience or threaten consequences. It asked the woman closest to Charles to become a bridge between father and son, never the wall separating them. The warning was personal because the Queen believed Camilla's influence could either calm a future fracture or deepen it. Years later, Charles now held that warning in his own hands. One question had become impossible to avoid. Did Camilla remember receiving it? And if she did, what had she believed Elizabeth was really asking of her? The warning had survived in silence for years. Now Charles was about to place it back in front of the woman for whom it had originally been written. There were no advisors around the table when Charles finally spoke to Camilla. No private secretary to soften the language. No official statement waiting outside the door. Only husband, wife, and the words of a dead queen resting between them. Charles did not accuse her of betrayal. That would have been easier. Instead, he asked a quieter question: whether she remembered the message. Camilla's reaction told him immediately that the document was not entirely a surprise. Charles had insisted on privacy, because he refused to let palace officials explain Elizabeth's intentions before Camilla could speak for herself. The original message lay between them, not a summary prepared by aides. A private secretary, a senior royal aide who manages official correspondence and schedules, had been deliberately excluded. This was not palace business yet. It was a husband asking his wife what she remembered about his mother's warning. Charles slid the page across the table. Camilla read only the opening lines before setting it down. "I know this letter," she said quietly. The king did not move. She leaned back, wounded less by the words themselves than by the possibility that an old exchange with Elizabeth was now being treated like evidence against her. Charles watched her carefully and asked the question he had been carrying since the file surfaced. Had she ever feared that he might be forced to choose between her and William? Camilla finally answered. She remembered the warning clearly, but she rejected the idea that Elizabeth had condemned her. The Queen, she said, had also expressed confidence in her ability to steady Charles and help preserve the relationship between father and son. William mattered because he was not simply family. As the next heir, his bond with the sovereign carried consequences for the monarchy's future continuity. That was exactly why Elizabeth had written. Then Camilla revealed something Charles had not seen in the file. She had answered the message. In a short written reply, she had promised Elizabeth that she would never ask Charles to diminish William's place or treat the prince as a rival. Her account was specific, and it changed the confrontation instantly. If that reply existed, why had it not been stored beside the original? Charles looked down at the document again. One message suggested warning. Camilla's memory suggested trust. Somewhere between those two versions sat the truth Elizabeth had intended to preserve. And now, for the first time, Charles realized the missing reply might matter as much as the warning itself. The confrontation answered one question, but created another. If Elizabeth's message was personal rather than constitutional, why did its discovery suddenly carry enough weight to shake the king's decisions? A queen's private message is not an act of parliament. It cannot rewrite succession, strip a title, or command a future sovereign from beyond the grave. Charles knew that. His advisors knew it. Camilla knew it too. And yet the page sitting inside the palace carried something more difficult to dismiss than legal authority. It carried Elizabeth's judgment, and for her son, that moral weight was almost impossible to separate from the crown itself. Charles understood the limits clearly. An act of parliament is a law passed through parliament and given royal assent. Elizabeth's private message was nothing like that. It had no constitutional force, meaning it could not legally bind the sovereign, alter succession, or dictate how he handled his marriage. The king remained free to decide. But freedom did not make the decision easier at all. Charles felt trapped by a different kind of authority. He had spent a lifetime measuring himself against his mother's discipline, and now her private fear seemed to follow him from beyond her reign. He refused to let Camilla be treated as though she had been secretly convicted of disloyalty. A queen consort had answered him directly, and he believed she deserved proof before judgment. William reacted with discomfort when Charles quietly told him that a document concerning his future had surfaced. The prince did not celebrate. He did not ask what power it gave him. Instead, he warned his father that Elizabeth's memory should never become a weapon against Camilla. For William, that mattered because any victory gained through humiliation would poison the very continuity his grandmother had tried to protect. Then the archive changed everything. A senior archivist produced a catalog entry confirming that Camilla's written reply had been received and stored separately. Charles traced one line with his finger, exhaled slowly, and said, "Then she did answer." The notation summarized her promise in a phrase that struck him hard. The line ahead must never become the rival within. Charles read the words again. The line ahead meant William and the succession that would follow him. The phrase described the future heir not as competition, but as continuity. Camilla had understood Elizabeth's warning. She had promised not to turn father and son into opposing camps. That discovery cleared one suspicion, but it created a harder test. Charles no longer had to ask whether Camilla had ignored his mother's warning. He had to ask whether the balance of influence around him still honored the promise she once made. Camilla had not ignored Elizabeth's warning. But proving that only made the next stage more painful, because Charles now had to decide whether the spirit of that promise had survived. The document never needed to become law to change the palace. The moment Charles accepted that Elizabeth's warning had been sincere, and Camilla's promise equally sincere, he began looking at his own household differently. Meetings that once seemed routine suddenly carried emotional meaning. Small decisions about access, influence, and succession planning felt heavier. And inside the family, everyone sensed that the king was quietly rearranging boundaries he had avoided confronting for years. Charles began changing the way sensitive family discussions reached him. Succession planning, the private work of preparing for how royal duties and responsibilities passed to the next monarch, could no longer be filtered through layers of personal loyalty. He wanted a cleaner line between Camilla's role as his wife and William's position as the heir. Nothing was announced. No title changed. But the balance inside the household shifted. Camilla noticed first. One palace meeting ended earlier than usual, and Charles asked William to remain behind. The queen consort stayed seated as the door closed, then gathered her papers slowly, understanding what no one had said aloud. She had not been removed from anything, yet she could feel a new boundary forming, and the silence around it hurt more than a formal decision might have. Charles felt that pain too. He had wanted to protect continuity without making Camilla feel rejected. But every adjustment seemed to resemble the choice Elizabeth had feared. The king knew why it mattered. William needed direct access to his father because one day he would inherit not only the throne, but the unresolved pressures surrounding it. Still, Charles worried that strengthening one bond might weaken another. William understood the change when his father personally requested regular private meetings with no additional relatives or senior courtiers present. A courtier is a member of the royal household who supports the monarch and family in official life. The prince did not treat the new access as victory. Instead, he recognized how palace machinery had allowed distance to grow between them, and how one private message had forced both men to confront it. Camilla surprised them. She did not object, challenge the arrangement, or ask Charles to reverse it. Instead, she made one request. She wanted to read Elizabeth's message again, from beginning to end. The queen consort's calm unsettled him, because this time there was no defensiveness in her voice. Charles agreed. He knew the next conversation would not be about protocol or power. It would be about what his mother had truly asked of them. The palace expected resistance. What came instead was a private conversation that stripped away titles, advisors, and years of defensiveness, and exposed the fear beneath every careful compromise. The turning point did not happen in a council chamber. It happened with no aides present and no formal agenda. Camilla asked Charles to bring Elizabeth's message back into the room, and this time she read every line slowly. When she finished, she did not defend herself. She did not question William's role. Instead, she said something Charles had not expected to hear. Perhaps his mother had been asking her to protect him from a choice he should never have to make. Camilla no longer sounded wounded. The earlier confrontation had burned through anger and left something quieter behind. She told Charles that Elizabeth's warning was never asking her to disappear from his life. It was asking her not to become a barrier between him and the future of the institution he led. Constitutional responsibilities, meaning the duties tied to the monarch and the next heir, rather than ordinary family matters, had to remain clear. Camilla admitted something difficult. Her instinct had always been to protect Charles, because she had watched duty consume years of his life and turn every private weakness into public pressure. She had wanted to shield him from conflict, but she now understood that protection could become harmful when it kept him from facing the people he needed most. William was not simply another source of pressure. He was his son and the future king. Charles answered with his own admission. He had sometimes allowed aides, schedules, and other people to become buffers, because direct conversations with William were harder than formal meetings. The king could no longer blame distance entirely on circumstances or on Camilla's influence. He had helped create it by avoiding moments that felt too personal. Then Camilla made the choice Elizabeth had once asked of her. She told Charles she would step away from any informal involvement in conversations specifically concerning William's future constitutional role. The queen consort was not surrendering her place beside him. She was drawing a line between being his wife and shaping the path of his heir. Camilla asked for only one thing in return. She told Charles not to use Elizabeth's message to punish himself or rewrite their marriage as some mistake his mother had secretly feared. Charles heard the pain beneath that request, and for the first time since the document surfaced, he understood that both women had been trying to protect him in different ways. Camilla folded the message and pushed it gently toward Charles. She told him his mother had been trying to keep a door open between father and son. The king reached across the table and took her hand. Charles accepted her choice. Then he requested a private meeting with William. The warning that had threatened to divide Charles and Camilla was now doing the opposite. But outside palace walls, Elizabeth's secret message was becoming impossible to contain. By morning, what had been a private struggle inside the royal household had become a national fascination. The public did not have Elizabeth's full message, but it had enough. A private warning, Camilla's name, William's future, and a king described as deeply shaken by his mother's words. Suddenly, every old royal tension was being dragged back into daylight. Yet the version unfolding outside the palace was far harsher than the truth Charles and Camilla had finally confronted together. Charles understood the danger immediately. Palace communications staff, the team responsible for handling official royal statements and media responses, faced a brutal choice: deny too much, and speculation would grow; confirm too much, and Elizabeth's private correspondence could be treated like public evidence. The king decided the document itself would remain sealed. The palace would acknowledge only that private family correspondence existed and refused to publish its contents. Camilla felt the cost of that silence first. Headlines reduced Elizabeth's careful warning to a simple rejection of her, stripping away the trust and responsibility woven through the message. The queen consort had already accepted a painful boundary inside the family. Yet outside the palace, she was being cast as the reason that boundary had become necessary. She did not retreat from her duties, but the distortion wounded her. William refused to let that distortion become a weapon. In a private documented briefing with his father, he made clear that he would not benefit from any public humiliation of Camilla. The prince understood that turning the story into a victory for himself would destroy the very continuity Elizabeth had wanted to protect. Charles heard that and realized his son was choosing restraint over advantage. Then the story exploded into public view. Outside a London newsstand, a fictional morning front page carried 3 enormous words: the Queen's final warning. Photographs of Charles, Camilla, and William appeared beneath it. Within hours, a crowd gathered near Buckingham Palace as broadcasters framed the document as proof that Elizabeth was still shaping the monarchy even after her death. Charles saw the headline before leaving for an engagement. He looked at it briefly, folded the paper inward until the words disappeared, and handed it back without comment. That same day, Charles and William appeared together at their scheduled engagement. The king stayed close to his son, and the prince matched his calm. Camilla continued her own public duties rather than disappear under pressure. The contrast was deliberate. Outside, the story looked like war. Inside, the family had already begun choosing something else. The public had turned Elizabeth's warning into a royal verdict. Charles now had to decide whether he would do the same, or finally understand what his mother had actually been asking of him. In the end, Charles refused to choose between his wife and his heir, because he finally understood that Elizabeth's message had never asked him to. Her warning was not a demand that Camilla be pushed aside. It was a plea that love, loyalty, and royal duty never be allowed to become competing kingdoms around the same man. And once Charles saw that clearly, the document that had initially torn him apart became something unexpected. A final lesson from his mother. Charles made his decision quietly. Elizabeth's message would remain sealed as private family correspondence, not transformed into a constitutional instruction or a weapon against Camilla. Constitutional instruction means formal guidance tied to the legal duties of the monarchy, and this letter had never carried that power. Still, the king accepted its central principle. William should never have to reach his father through layers of family influence. Charles told Camilla what the discovery had done to him. At first, he had feared his mother secretly doubted their marriage. Now he believed Elizabeth had been asking the queen consort to use the strength of that marriage responsibly, not surrender it. Camilla understood the difference. She would remain beside him, but she would step back when conversations concerned William's future responsibilities as heir. William met Charles privately one final time. The prince did not demand more authority or treat the moment as a victory. He told his father that he wanted clarity, trust, and the freedom to disagree, without either man treating disagreement as disloyalty. The king heard something simple beneath those words. His son wanted a relationship, not an advantage. Then the missing piece returned. An archival review reunited Camilla's old written reply with Elizabeth's original message. An archival review is the careful examination and organization of stored historical records. Together, the documents completed the exchange. One queen had expressed a fear, and the woman who later became queen had promised not to let that fear define the family. Charles punished no one. Camilla kept her place beside him. William gained a clearer path into long-term planning, and the triangle Elizabeth had feared was replaced by boundaries built on trust rather than suspicion. After his final meeting with William, Charles returned the message to its folder. This time, he did not hesitate. He closed it, placed it aside, and walked away, knowing his mother's words had finally reached their true purpose. Elizabeth had never asked him to choose. She had asked them all to stop making love and duty feel like enemies ever again inside. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.